السلام عليكم، صباح الخير يا اخوان اخوات. ودي اني ابدا ارحب معالي وزير خارجية الولايات المتحدة والصديق جون كيري. لا شك ان زيارة وزير خارجية الولايات المتحدة للإمارات في هذا الوقت وهذه الظروف، خاصة بعد اللقاءات في جنيف، كانت رسالة قوية لمدى العلاقة اللي تربط الولايات المتحدة مع الإمارات العربية المتحدة. وأعتقد أن كانت زيارة مثمرة، زيارة ناجحة، خاصة لقاء وزير الخارجية مع سمو ولي العهد أمس، اللي تبادلنا فيها كثير من وجهات النظر حول قضايا المنطقة، إن كان المباحثات في جنيف، الوضع السوري، التطورات الإيجابية في مصر. ولا شك أن زيارة الصديق والزميل جون كيري إلى القاهرة كانت رسالة كثير إيجابية وكثير قوية في مدى التشجيع الدولي وتشجيع الولايات المتحدة لخرط الطريق في مصر. وأخيراً كانت لنا فرصة أيضاً نبحث عن تطورات عملية السلام اللي وزير الخارجية يقوم بجهد مشكور وجهد قوي، وأريد أقول أيضاً هو أهم وأقوى وأفضل جهد أنا رأيته شخصياً من قبل أي إدارة أمريكية لدفع مسيرة السلام بين الفلسطينيين والإسرائيليين. صديق جون كيري، شكراً جزيلاً وأهلا وسهلا فيك.
Well, good morning, and a special thank you to His Highness Abdullah bin Zayed for welcoming me here today. I thank him also for his friendship. Foreign Minister bin Zayed has really become one of the people who has contributed significantly to a number of our initiatives and my own efforts here in the region. And I'm grateful to him for not just his counsel and advice, but for his friendship. I also want to thank His Highness Mohammed bin Zayed for the depth of conversation we had last night, as well as a very good dinner and a long walk together, and some time to really dig into the issues of the region and create better understanding of our mutual efforts and interests with respect to those. It's wonderful to be back in Abu Dhabi. My visits regrettably wind up being much too brief, and I've been invited to come back and spend a little time sometime when I can really get to share some of the life of the city and the region, and I intend to do that. His Highness and I spoke today about the strong, enduring relationship between the United States and the United Arab Emirates. And this is a relationship that is based on a joint commitment to security and to stability in the region. Today we talked about our shared efforts to end the war, the violence in Syria, to address the humanitarian crisis and bring about a peaceful resolution to the civil war in Syria, which has cost way too many lives of so many Syrians, and which is breeding increasing extremism, radical religious extremism, and terrorists who are a threat to all of us, to the region and to the peace and security and stability of Syria itself. We appreciate the UAE's leadership in supporting the Syrian opposition coalition and its commitment alongside our international partners to convening the Geneva II conference as soon as possible. And both of us are encouraged and pleased to be able to take note of the fact that yesterday the opposition voted to go to Geneva II. This is a big step forward and a significant one, and we will continue to work on the humanitarian and other issues that are of such immediate crisis. A negotiated solution is the best way to increase the stability throughout the entire region, and it is the only way to end the bloodshed as soon as possible and give the Syrian people the future that they deserve. His Highness and I also discussed the developments in Egypt. I was pleased to be there at the beginning of this journey, and we discussed our belief that Egypt's transition to a stable, inclusive, and ultimately democratic civilian-led government that respects the rights and freedoms of all Egyptians is critical, not only for that country, but for the entire region. We agreed last night in our discussions with His Highness Mohammed bin Zayed, as well as today in our discussions, to work together, not down the road, not figuratively, not in the future, but now, immediately, to work together in order to create specific efforts that we can jointly work on, as well as with the Saudi Arabians and others, in order to transform economically and politically the Egypt that needs to emerge. We share a belief in the importance of Egypt to the region, and we want to make sure that the interim government does succeed. We also agreed that as it succeeds, part of the definition of that success is the need to implement reforms and to protect universal rights and transition to an inclusive election process that respects the rights of the people of Egypt. Finally, I also provided an update on the meeting of the P5+1 in Geneva. And I made it clear that while we made progress, good progress, very significant progress, in narrowing the gaps between our partners in the P5+1 and Iran, this is not a race to complete just any agreement. No deal is better than a bad deal, I have said many times, as has President Obama. But through diplomacy, we have an absolute responsibility to pursue an agreement. The sanctions were put in place to bring about negotiations. How irresponsible it would be to the concept of diplomacy, as well as the potential of any future use of force, if we have just put the sanctions on and then ignore the opportunity to have a negotiation. Having a negotiation does not mean you've given up anything. It means you will put to test what is possible and what is needed, and whether or not Iran is prepared to do what is necessary to prove that its program can only be a peaceful program. As President Obama has said clearly since day one, he will not allow Iran to acquire a nuclear weapon. And the United States is committed to protecting our security and the security of our allies from the unthinkable consequences of what would happen were they to secure such a weapon. We also are well aware, more than conscious, of the instability that would be triggered in this region were that program to continue and not be peaceful. It's also worth asking everybody, what would happen if we don't find a diplomatic path forward? Obviously, Iran will continue to ramp up enrichment activities and advance on the plutonium track, while we would risk losing the international coalition that has been built up to keep Iran isolated. That also is a risk of not pursuing the negotiation. I want to emphasize this very, very strongly to my friend Sheikh Abdullah, as well as to all people in this region, and that is that we have a strong strategic relationship that has been built up over many years. It is also a friendship. And the United States will do nothing in negotiating with Iran that will change that relationship. I want to make that clear. I thank His Highness again for welcoming me to Dubai. I emphasize that the President has said publicly at the United Nations that the United States of America will, into the future, as long as he is President, make certain that we will stand up for and defend our allies in this region against any kind of external threat or attack. So this is a strong strategic relationship, and I look forward to continuing our important dialogue on many issues of regional concern and to strengthening the relationship that the United States values very deeply. Thank you.
So due to time restriction, we'll be taking 2 questions only, one from the local media and one from the international media. The person on the second row, third row.
السلام عليكم. رائد برقاوي من صحيفة الخليج الإمارات. ما زال رغم التأكيدات الأمريكية لكن هناك مخاوف على مستوى الشعبي وحتى الحكومي في دول مجلس التعاون من أن العلاقات مع إيران والتحسن بها سيضعف العلاقات الاستراتيجية مع الولايات المتحدة مع دول الخليج. المخاوف ما زالت قائمة. التطمينات دائما تكون هناك تطمينات لكن يتم تغيرها بين فترة وأخرى. على مستوى المحلي الدول الشركات المحلية دفعت ثمنا كبيرا في التزامها بفرض بالعقوبات المفروضة على إيران. ما هي الضمانات الأمريكية في هذا المجال على أن لا تكون العقوبات عند رفعها انتقائية بين مكان وآخر؟ شكرا.
John, you want to take that first?
Well, thank you. Thank you for the question. And in many ways, I think I tried to address that question in the course of my comments a moment ago, but I'm happy to re-emphasize and to repeat as strongly as I can. President Obama is a man of his word. When he ran for president, he said that he would do whatever was necessary to go after Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. And when somebody asked him, does that mean that you'd be prepared to cross into Pakistan and even chase him there, would you do that? And he said, I will do whatever is necessary if I have information that protects the security of the United States. He was criticized for that. His opposition said, you're naive and you don't understand. But guess what? The President of the United States got that information, and he acted on that information, and he did what was necessary. And so today, Osama bin Laden is no longer with us, and most of the leadership and most of the core of Al-Qaeda within Pakistan is gone, most of it. Now, there's still threats in other parts of the world, and the President is continuing to address those threats. Currently working with Saudi Arabia with respect to the challenge in Yemen, working with Somalia, and has made great gains with respect to the transformation taking place in Somalia. The President remains committed and has just asked me to negotiate a bilateral security agreement with the President of Afghanistan, which will mean there will be a sustained American presence if the Loya Jirga accepts it. There will be a sustained international security force presence in Afghanistan to secure what has been worked for so hard over so many years. The President kept his word. The President said we would wind down the war in Iraq, and he wound down the war in Iraq. The President said we would hold Gaddafi accountable and not permit him to be able to attack civilians in Benghazi, and he did it. The president made a decision that he would go in and attack in Syria in order to hold Assad accountable to not use his chemical weapons. And before he had to finally pull that trigger or make that decision, he made his decision, but before he had to actually execute, we were able to strike an agreement to get all of the weapons out, which actually goes further than would have achieved otherwise. So every time the president has said, I'm going to do something, he has done it. He is stating clearly Iran will not get a nuclear weapon. That is a centerpiece of his foreign policy, and he will not bluff. As he said to me point blank, when I became Secretary of State, I asked him about it. He said, I don't bluff. This is our policy. Now, he also has said his first choice is diplomacy. It should be any responsible leader's first choice. Nobody should rush to war. I've fought in a war. I know what war is like. Nobody should rush to war. War should be the last resort. War should be only the failure of diplomacy. But the president is prepared to defend the notion that it is unacceptable for Iran to have a nuclear weapons program, because we all know what happens if that happens. It is a threat to Israel, it's a threat to the region, it is the threat here, and we will see other countries then chase a weapon, and that will make a more dangerous world. Now, Iran has said that its program is peaceful. The Supreme Leader says he has issued a fatwa, the highest form of Islamic prohibition against some activity. And he said that is to prohibit Iran from ever seeking a nuclear weapon. What we are seeking to do is transform that fatwa into a legal code that universally is acceptable, so that we can in fact prove that the program is peaceful. And I have said to you today on behalf of the President of the United States, and the President of the United States has said for himself in his speech at the United Nations, that he will continue to defend his friends and allies in this region, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, others. He will defend them against any external attack. That is the promise of the President of the United States, and as I stand here as Secretary of State, as long as I am Secretary of State, that is also our policy, my policy, the policy of the State Department, representing the President of the United States in executing it. So these aren't just words. In international diplomacy, you don't just stand up and say something and it's meaningless. This is a policy from a powerful nation and a friend of this region and a friend of the United Arab Emirates. And when I come here to say that this is the President's policy, it is the President's policy, and he will stand by it. So we will continue to work on this, and with respect to the sanctions, we know that the United Arab Emirates and others have paid a great price. Just today in our conversation, I learned that it has gone from some $23 billion of business down to $4 billion. That's a huge sacrifice. So we have real partners in the United Arab Emirates with respect to the sanctions, and that's something that the United States Congress and others need to take note of as we think about where we are going in the future. We will continue the sanctions regime. Our hope is that in the next months we can find an agreement that meets everybody's standard. Now, I want to say one word. You didn't ask this, but I want to say one word about it, because I'm reading the press that has been indicating some sort of a lack of agreement among the P5 plus one or something to that effect. That's just not correct. The P5 plus one was unified on Saturday, when we presented a proposal to the Iranians. And the French signed off on it, we signed off on it, everybody agreed this was a fair proposal. There was unity. But Iran couldn't take it. At that particular moment, they weren't able to accept that particular agreement. So hard work was done, progress was made, the P5+1 was united. There is a gap still between what language may be appropriate that they're prepared to accept, but the concept that we are all working on, we have absolute unity on. That we cannot have a weapons program, and we must have guarantees that we're being clear enough in what is required so that this is not if and not possible and not speculative, but absolutely certain that we know the road ahead is well defined and can protect the interests of everybody.
نحن في الإمارات سعيدين لسير المفاوضات في جنيف، ولا شك أن نشجع الحوار بين ال5+1 وإيران. وأيضا في نفس الوقت نحن مرتاحين من حجم وسرعة والتشاور بيننا وبين الولايات المتحدة وبقية ال5+1 حول سير إن كانت هذه المفاوضات أو المفاوضات السابقة، ليس فقط في سير المفاوضات ولكن حتى في بحث مستقبل هذه المفاوضات وكيفية تطوير الاتصال أو تطوير هذا الحوار بين 5+1 وإيران. لا شك أن هذه فترة صعبة للمفاوضات، ولكن نحن مدركين ونرى أن أفضل حل للملف النووي الإيراني هو عبر الحوار السياسي والدبلوماسي. نتأمل أن تصل إيران قريبا إلى الرؤية أن لا خيار أمامها إلا أن تكون واضحة وشفافة حول برنامجها النووي، حول ملفها النووي، ليس فقط مع ال5+1 ولكن أيضا مع منظمة الطاقة الدولية. نرى أن هناك بوادر إيجابية، ولكن هناك جهد وعمل لا زال كبير على الإيرانيين أن يبذلوه. أعتقد عندنا سؤال واحد باقي.
سؤال زيادة. We still have one more question from the international media. The gentleman on the third row with the blue shirt.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Mr. Secretary, the Prime Minister of Israel, as you know, is calling world leaders to marshal opposition to an interim deal with Iran. Other Israeli leaders are rallying Jewish groups to oppose it, and you're returning to Washington tonight to face a restive Congress. Are you concerned that in this 10-day pause before you reconvene in Geneva, that enough opposition will build up that may scuttle the progress you made and make an interim deal impossible? To the Minister, you expressed a confidence with the consultation and encouraged the P5 to continue pushing toward a deal. Would you support a deal that granted Iran the right to enrich uranium? And as a follow-up, on Syria, if I may, at the beginning of this trip in Saudi Arabia, your neighbor expressed, this is to the Minister, strong concerns about U.S. policy in Syria. Did you hear anything from the Secretary today that assuaged your own concerns about U.S. policy in Syria? And then lastly, for the Secretary, are you concerned, sir, that the Saudis and the Emiratis may simply go their own way with Syria, leading to potentially dangerous results that the U.S. would then have to deal with? Thank you both.
Let me deal with the last question first, because I want to get that off. No, I am not concerned. I believe we have a very clear understanding with respect to the goals, what we're trying to achieve. The United States continues to support the opposition in many different ways. We are providing significant assistance. We want to coordinate as closely as possible with our friends, the Saudis and the Emiratis and others. I think we both agree that we need to get a couple of other actors in the region, not us, actually, but others to be unified. But the Saudis, Emiratis, the United States, Jordanians are very clear about what groups ought to be receiving support, how we ought to proceed, what we ought to be doing. And we all agree that we see no way that Assad has any legitimacy to be able to continue to actually bring the country together and lead it with any kind of legitimacy whatsoever. So we're very much, I think, in agreement with respect to that and the direction. With respect to Prime Minister Netanyahu and his position, yesterday Undersecretary Wendy Sherman went directly to Israel in order to brief the Israelis in full on precisely what the negotiation is entailing, what the terms are. My hope is, look, I've worked very closely with Prime Minister Netanyahu, particularly in these last months. He has been very constructive in working on the things we're trying to do with respect to Middle East peace. I have enormous respect for his political acumen and his deep concerns about the security of his country. We share those concerns. For 29 years, just a little shy, I spent in the United States Senate. I have a 100% voting record of defending Israel. And I'm not about to change my feelings about what we need to do to provide security for Israel going forward, even as I work on this process. But I believe the Prime Minister needs to recognize that no agreement has been reached about the end game here. That's the subject of the negotiation. The sanctions were put in place in order to bring about a negotiation, because the first order of business of any superpower is to exercise its power thoughtfully and respectfully. And if we had to turn to a military option because we are left no other option, we must show the world we have exhausted every possible remedy and opportunity. Nothing is given up in a first step that freezes the program and even sets it back while you begin to negotiate to see what is possible with respect to the proving of a peaceful nuclear program. That is the tough negotiation. And Israel and the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia and all other countries, particularly the P5+1 partners, will be sharing and working that information and process, if we get there, in an effort to find an agreement that everybody could feel comfortable with. So the time to oppose it is when you see what it is, not to oppose the effort to find out what is possible. And I would just say very respectfully that what we need to do here is recognize that we're very knowledgeable about nuclear programs and nuclear possibilities. We share intelligence very closely with the Israelis on this topic. We've been meeting constantly with the Israelis to understand exactly where Iran is today in its program. And we are confident that what we are doing can actually protect Israel more effectively and provide greater security to Israel. And we look forward to having an ongoing dialogue and conversation in a very civil and appropriate way with the Prime Minister, with our allies and deep friends, the Israelis, in an effort to try to see what can be achieved here. There is no existing right to enrich for anybody. The NPT does not grant a right, and it does not prohibit a right. Therefore, whatever might or might not happen in the future is subject to the negotiation and subject to what is possible in terms of limits, scope, verification, complete and total transparency and accountability for what might or might not happen. We don't know yet what those possibilities are. So that is why you need to have a negotiation. No one should ever fear a negotiation, because it takes two parties or more, if they're more, to say yes. And until they say yes, there's no agreement and nothing to fear. So I would say to everybody, the President has been clear, there is no rush to a deal, and no deal is better than a bad deal. That is our governing principle. And there may be a difference of opinion in certain people in the end as to what's bad and what's good, but this is subject to enormous global scrutiny. Experts all over the world will look at these judgments, and they will decide, is this real or is it not real? Does this put somebody at risk or does it not put them at risk? And we must at least trust the process enough to put it to the test. That's all we are trying to do.
أعتقد أن هناك مبالغات فيما يتعلق ب أن هناك في شد وجذب في العلاقة بين الولايات المتحدة وحلفائها في المنطقة. قد تكون هناك في اختلافات في وجهات نظر، اختلافات في بعض الخطوات، ولكن لا توجد هناك اختلافات حول الاستراتيجية الشاملة لقضايا المنطقة بغض النظر عن هذه القضايا، ولكن هناك في اختلاف قد تكون في وجهات نظر أو في التكتيك، وهذا يحدث بين الدول. فليكون واضح، أعتقد أن وسائل الإعلام أو بعض التسريبات في وسائل الإعلام دفعت هذه الاختلافات في الرؤى وعكستها كأن هناك في اختلاف في الاستراتيجية بين الولايات المتحدة ودول المنطقة. فأحب أطمن في هذا الوضع، في هذه النقطة العلاقة في أفضل حالاتها بين الإمارات وبين الولايات المتحدة، وزيارة صديقي وزير خارجية اليوم للإمارات خير دليل لقوة هذه العلاقة، وما سمعناه منه لا شك يؤكد وجه نظري. فيما يتعلق بالتخصيب، وأنا أريد أتكلم حول البرامج النووية بشكل عام. الإمارات تمتلك برنامج نووي في غاية الشفافية. نحن نعتقد أن البرنامج النووي الإماراتي هو المعيار الذي لابد أن تمتثل فيه دول المنطقة، وهذا المعيار يتجسد أولاً بأن لا نحن في الإمارات قبلنا على أنفسنا ألا نخصب أولاً. اثنين، قبلنا على أنفسنا ألا نعيد المعالجة ما بعد استخلاص اليورانيوم المخصب. فيما يتعلق بهذه المعيارين أو في هذا الطرفين في نموذجنا الذهبي، نعتقد امتلاك البرنامج النووي السلمي هنا يصبح في إمكان الجميع إذا هذه الدول قابلة أن تمتثل بالMPT، قابلة أن تمتثل بالبروتوكول الإضافي، فهنا لا يوجد خوف، بل بالعكس الكل مستفيد. وخير دليل أن البرنامج الإماراتي اليوم يشهد ليس فقط القبول الدولي، ولكن يرى الشراكة الدولية هو من أسرع البرامج تطبيقاً، ولكن أيضاً من أكثر البرامج اجتذاباً للدول في توقيع اتفاقيات بين الإمارات وهذه الدول. عندما تأتي بلد صديق مثل الولايات المتحدة وتضع اتفاقها مع الإمارات ال1 2 3 كمعياراً ذهبياً لكل الاتفاقيات المستقبلية بين الولايات المتحدة وبين الدول الأخرى، هو دليل آخر أن نهجنا هو النهج السليم. فإذا نستطيع أن نرى هذا النهج يستمر وينتشر في المنطقة، أنا متأكد أن هذا القلق لن يكون موجود. Your Excellency, thank you very much for your support and your friendship.
شكرا لحضوركم. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.